There is something about the night that makes old stories feel true again. The world quiets down, the lights go low, and somewhere in that soft darkness, the old legends breathe a little easier. So settle in, get comfortable, let the day go. Because tonight, we are going somewhere very far away, to a place that lives between history and myth, between the game cartridge and the dream. We are going into the deep lore of legendary Pokemon, and we are going slowly. No rush, nowhere to be. Just the stories, the details, the strange and beautiful corners of a universe that has been quietly building itself for nearly 30 years. These are the beings that don't follow the rules. They don't appear in tall grass for a random encounter. They don't sit politely in someone's PC box waiting to be traded. They dwell in places you have to earn the right to reach. Peaks wrapped in cloud. Ocean floors that haven't seen sunlight in 1,000 years. Dimensions that don't run on the same time as ours. And every single one of them has a story, most of which never made it into a Pokedex entry, never got explained in a cutscene, never showed up on a loading screen tip. You had to go looking, and tonight, we've gone looking for you. So breathe out, let your shoulders drop, and let's begin at the only place that makes sense. The very beginning. Section 1. The Egg in the Void and the God who hatched from it. Before anything existed, there was nothing. Not darkness in the way we think of it, not an empty room with the lights off, nothing as in the literal absence of dimension. No space to be empty, no time to pass, no matter, no thought. Just a kind of infinite, formless non-existence, hanging there without even the concept of hanging there to give it shape. And then, from that void, something appeared. An egg. The Sinnoh creation myth, recorded in the ancient texts of the Canalave Library on an island in the northern reaches of the region, describes it this way. In the beginning of everything, there was a churning vortex of chaos. Out of that chaos, a single egg came into being, and from that egg, the first living thing was born. It was called Arceus, and the ancient people of Sinnoh simply called it the original one. Arceus is not a Pokemon in the way we usually think of Pokemon. It doesn't fit neatly into any of our categories. Its Pokedex entry in Diamond and Pearl says something remarkable, that it is said to have shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms. 1,000 arms is not a literal count of limbs. It's the same kind of language you find in the oldest mythologies of our own world, in descriptions of Hindu deities and ancient cosmological texts, where immensity of power gets expressed as multiplicity of form. The point is that Arceus did not use one tool to make existence. It used everything it had, every possible expression of its being, to construct a universe out of nothing. What did it make first? 3 beings. 3 expressions of the most fundamental forces a universe needs to function. Dialga, who would govern time. Palkia, who would govern space. Giratina, who would govern antimatter. The interesting thing about this trio is that they weren't separate creations, assembled one after another like furniture. They emerged simultaneously from eggs Arceus created, hatching into their origin forms. The raw, unrestrained versions of themselves that look quite different from the forms most people know. In the original Sinnoh mythology, Dialga and Palkia were the primary architects of the physical universe. Time began to flow because Dialga existed. Space unfurled and became measurable because Palkia existed. And the universe as we know it, a place with dimensions and causality and the ability to hold physical matter, became real. Giratina's role is more complicated and frankly more fascinating. Giratina represents antimatter, which in physics is real. Every particle of matter has a corresponding antiparticle, and when they meet, they annihilate each other in a burst of pure energy. In the Pokemon world, antimatter is personified as a Pokemon that exists in violent opposition to the ordered, material universe that Dialga and Palkia built. Giratina is chaos to their structure. It is undoing to their creation. And at some point, for reasons the ancient texts leave deliberately vague, Arceus judged Giratina's violent nature too dangerous to remain in the world it was helping to build. It was banished, not destroyed, banished. Arceus sent Giratina to the Distortion World, a dimension that doesn't run on the same rules as ours. In the Distortion World, the laws of physics as Dialga and Palkia established them simply don't apply. Gravity can run sideways. Water flows in loops that never end. A waterfall falls upward. There is no day or night because there is no sun and no sky as we'd recognize them. It is quite literally a mirror of physical reality, a place where everything works backwards or wrongwards or not at all. And Giratina has existed there, alone for the entire history of the universe. Here is something that most people don't think about when they look at the story. Giratina was made at the same time as Dialga and Palkia. It is their equal in raw power. Cynthia, the Sinnoh champion, describes it exactly this way when she discusses the creation myth with the player in Diamond and Pearl. Three beings of equal power, and one of them was exiled. Not because it was weak, not because it failed, but because its specific nature, its representation of destruction and antimatter, was too destabilizing for a universe that was just learning to exist. That's a quietly tragic story, if you sit with it. The universe needed all three of them to be born. But once the universe was running, only two of them got to live in it. The other detail worth dwelling on is the Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, three small, quiet creatures who live at the bottoms of three lakes in the Sinnoh region. They represent knowledge, emotion, and willpower respectively, and in the mythology, Arceus created them specifically as a kind of failsafe. If Dialga or Palkia ever became uncontrollable, if time started tearing or space began collapsing, the Lake Guardians were designed to calm them down. They hold materials that can be used to forge the Red Chain, a mythical binding that can restrain even a god of time or a god of space. Think about what that implies. Even Arceus, having just made these unimaginably powerful beings, immediately recognized they might need to be reined in. It built the leash into the universe alongside the things that might need leashing. That's either extraordinary wisdom or extraordinary anxiety, and the myth doesn't clarify which. After all of this creation, the cosmos, the flow of time, the expansion of space, the lake spirits, the distortion world for its unwanted child, Arceus did something that feels very human. It rested. According to the myth, it fell asleep. The Sinnoh people who worshipped it even called it the Almighty Sinnoh. Though interestingly, the Diamond Clan and the Pearl Clan of ancient Hisui each believed in a slightly different version of this being. The Diamond Clan worshipped what they called the Lord of Time, and the Pearl Clan worshipped the Lord of Space. Neither group initially knew both existed, or that they were two aspects of the same creation. It took an encounter with both Dialga and Palkia, the beings themselves, enormous and incomprehensible, for those ancient people to understand that the truth was broader than either clan's version of it. We still don't fully know what Arceus looks like beyond a base form. Its plate mechanic allows it to shift its very type, its fundamental nature, depending on what it holds. It can be any type in the game. It can express itself as any force in existence, which, if you think about it, is exactly what a god of creation should be able to do. Not locked into one expression, not contained by a single element, but capable of becoming whatever the moment requires. The 1,000 arms expressed as 1,000 possible natures. And somewhere in the Pokemon world, in a ruin, in a quiet hall, in the deep silence of a place humans rarely visit, Arceus is still there, still watching, still running the universe like clockwork from somewhere just beyond what we can see. If you're still awake enough to do it, drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is. And if you haven't already, a subscription would mean a lot. Now back to the stories. Section 2. Dialga, Palkia, and the Banished God of Antimatter. We touched on them in the first chapter, but they deserve their own slow walk through the details, because Dialga and Palkia are stranger and richer than their surface descriptions suggest. Dialga is a Steel and Dragon-type Pokemon. It is blue and gray, covered in metallic plates, and at the center of its chest glows the Adamant Orb, a crystal that focuses and concentrates its power over time. When Dialga exists, time exists. The Sinnoh Pokédex puts it simply, its heartbeat is what makes time flow. That is not a metaphor in the context of the lore. Time moves because Dialga moves. If Dialga stopped, if its heart stopped, the entire direction of causality would freeze. Not pause like a video game pause screen. Freeze as in nothing could ever happen again because happening requires time. Palkia is a water and dragon type, pale violet and covered in smooth pearl-like gems embedded in the armor of its shoulders. It controls space, not outer space exactly, but the dimensions of physical reality itself. The places between things. The fact that here and there are different places. Palkia's Pokédex entry says it can warp space freely. In the mythology, Palkia's existence is why the universe has breadth. Without it, everything would occupy the same point. Distance wouldn't exist. In Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, the villain Cyrus of Team Galactic wants to use both Dialga and Palkia as tools. His goal is to destroy the existing universe and create a new one. A universe without spirit, without feeling, without the messy, emotional imperfections he believes ruin existence. He wants to use the Red Chain, made from the willpower and emotion embodied by the Lake Guardians, to bind and control Dialga and Palkia simultaneously, forcing them to unmake reality on command. It is, when you actually think about it, one of the most terrifying villain plans in the entire franchise. He's not trying to take over the world. He's trying to delete it. But here is a detail that gets overlooked. Cyrus's plan and the conflict it causes between the forces of time and space at the spear pillar atop Mount Coronet inadvertently tears a rift into the distortion world. And from that rift, after however many millions of years of isolation, Giratina comes through. Giratina doesn't come through to help anyone. It comes through because Cyrus has poisoned its world. The particle accelerators Team Galactic built to harvest energy from space and time were polluting the distortion world with their side effects. Giratina, in a sense, is not a savior. It's an enraged exile coming back to stop the thing that was making its prison even more unpleasant. There's something fascinating in that framing. The universe's most feared being, the one powerful enough that it had to be exiled, gets summoned back by human greed and arrogance. It's not a heroic return. It's a boundary being crossed, a consequence arriving. In Pokemon Legends Arceus, which takes place in an ancient version of Sinnoh called Hisui, the entire conflict of the story hinges on the aftermath of Giratina manipulating reality from within the distortion world to create a space-time rift above Mount Coronet. This rift sends Dialga and Palkia into rages, causes massive, unstable alpha Pokemon to appear, and puts the entire Hisui region in danger. The Wardens of the Pearl and Diamond clans have to work together for the first time in their factional history to help quell the crisis. And Arceus is watching the whole time, waiting, testing. In that game, the final encounter with Arceus is unlike anything else in the franchise. It arrives not as an enemy exactly, but as a judge. It tests the player to see if they are worthy of the knowledge of creation, worthy of understanding what it means for a universe to exist and for a single person within it to make choices that matter. The entire framing of the game, including the fact that you were pulled from another world into the ancient past, is Arceus conducting an experiment on you. Which raises the question that the game never fully answers. What does Arceus do with the ones who fail? The origin forms of Dialga and Palkia introduced in Legends. Arceus are worth describing because they are genuinely different from the forms most people know. Standard Dialga looks like a heavily armored dinosaur, built and deliberate. Its origin form is more fluid, longer-necked, more serpentine, less constructed. Standard Palkia looks like a standing warrior, upright and purposeful. Its origin form resembles a sea serpent, horizontal and sinuous. The suggestion of the designs is that these are more primal, less refined versions of the beings. The raw power before it settled into a shape that could coexist with a world. There is also a small, quiet detail that shows up in the ancient Sinnoh texts. When Arceus created the Lake Guardians, it gave Azelf's Fang, Uxie's Claw, and Mespri's Plume to be used in emergencies. These pieces of the Lake Guardians' beings can be used to forge the Red Chain. This means that 3 of the most gentle, wisdom-bearing, emotion-carrying beings in the Pokemon world have pieces of themselves that are also chains. That the very things which represent knowledge, feeling, and will can be twisted into instruments of control. That's not a comfortable detail, but the best mythology rarely is. and so the cosmos carries on. Time flowing because a blue-gray dragon breathes, space holding its shape because a violet dragon wills it to, an antimatter demon pressing its face against the walls of its prison, watching. And somewhere beyond all of it, the original egg's occupant sleeping in a meadow of golden fields, ringed by the creatures it made from the universe it built with arms that number in the hundreds of hundreds, dreaming of what else it might one day create. Section 3. The Three Birds of Kanto and the Myths They Carry. Long before anyone had heard the names Dialga or Arceus, there were three birds. They waited in specific places, and getting to them felt like a trial designed by the mountain itself. Articuno lived deep inside the Seafoam Islands, a network of icy caves carved by rushing underground rivers, where the current could sweep you backwards if you weren't careful. Zapdos lived inside an active power plant on Route 10, a building that smelled of ozone and hummed with electricity so dense it made your hair stand up. Moltres lived at the base of Victory Road, in the magma-heated tunnels just before the final climb to the Pokemon League. Before you could face the greatest trainers in the region, you had to walk past a living fire god. That wasn't an accident. The three legendary birds are among the oldest designed Pokemon in the franchise, created by Ken Sugimori for the original Red and Green games in 1996. Their English names are constructed in a specific, clever pattern that a lot of players noticed and loved. Articuno combines Arctic with uno, the Spanish word for one. Zapdos takes zap and adds dos, Spanish for two. Moltres takes molten and adds tres, Spanish for three. So their names are a counting sequence hidden inside elemental descriptions. First, the ice, second, the electricity, third, the fire. In Japanese, their names are freezer, thunder, and fire, considerably more blunt. But the international localization team gave them something more lyrical, and those names are now so embedded in the culture of Pokemon that they feel ancient themselves. The French names are worth knowing. In French, Articuno is called Articodin, after Odin, the Norse king of the gods. Zapdos becomes Electhor, after Thor, the Norse god of thunder, and Moltres is called Sulfura, with a suffix derived from Ra, the ancient Egyptian sun god. Three birds carrying the names of three of the most powerful deities from two completely different mythological traditions. It suggests that the localization team understood exactly what these birds were supposed to represent. Not just rare Pokemon, not just powerful game mechanics. Elemental forces made manifest, significant enough to carry divine names. The real-world mythological inspirations for their designs are rich. Articuno draws heavily from the Simurgh of Persian mythology, an enormous bird so ancient it is said to have witnessed the end of the world 3 times over. The Simurgh was believed to be the source of all knowledge, a creature that nested at the Tree of Life and had lived long enough to see the rise and fall of civilizations. It preferred cold, high places near water. Sound familiar? The Pokédex entries for Articuno describe it appearing to doomed travelers lost in icy mountains, which maps almost perfectly to the Simurgh's mythological role as a guide and protector for those in desperate circumstances. Zapdos pulls from multiple traditions at once. The most direct comparison is the Thunderbird, the enormous supernatural bird of North American indigenous cultures, particularly the Algonquin and Iroquois peoples, who described it as a being that created thunder by flapping its wings and lightning by blinking its eyes. The Thunderbird was not simply a dangerous creature, it was a force of weather, something that didn't have a habitat so much as it inhabited the sky itself. Zapdos's in-game lore, that it lives in thunderclouds, gathers power from lightning storms, and cannot really be said to have a fixed home, maps directly onto this. There's also a West African inspiration, the Impundulu, or lightning bird, from Zulu mythology, a creature that summons thunderbolts and is said to be inextricably linked to storms. Moltres draws most obviously from the phoenix, the universal symbol of death and rebirth through fire, but it specifically connects to several versions of the phoenix myth simultaneously. There's the Greek phoenix, which burns and rises from its own ashes. There's the Egyptian Bennu, a sacred heron-like bird associated with the sun god Ra, which was said to perch atop the primordial mound at the beginning of the world. And there's the Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent associated with fire, creation, and transformation, which Moltres echoes in its curved, flowing feathers. The Pokédex entry that says Moltres' body glows with a brilliant flame that never goes out, that it grows brighter and hotter when it's injured rather than dimmer, is a direct nod to the Phoenix's eternal, self-renewing fire. One of the quiet structural details about these three is their trio master. Lugia, which we'll get to in full detail later, is established as the guardian and controller of the three birds. In the second Pokemon movie, it's Lugia who must appear to calm the three birds when their conflict threatens to destroy the world's weather systems. The relationship makes a kind of elemental sense. Lugia is associated with water and the sea, which is the one natural force capable of extinguishing fire, taming electricity to some degree, and melting ice. It's also the sky above that contains all three of those phenomena. Ice storms, lightning, volcanic heat rising to meet cold air. The three birds represent seasonal or climatic forces as much as elemental ones. Articuno is winter, patient, silent, enduring, beautiful in a way that's also lethal. Zapdos is spring or storm season, volatile, sudden, energized with change. Moltres is summer, blazing, generous with heat but ruthless in its intensity. This isn't explicit in the game lore, but the Pokédex entries build this picture consistently across generations. Moltres is said to appear in southern regions as a sign of spring's arrival, its fire said to warm the earth back to life. Articuno is associated with appearing before harsh weather as a warning or an omen. Zapdos shows up during thunderstorms, feeds on the energy of nature at its most turbulent. Something that gets less attention is the stat history of these three across generations. In the original Red and Blue, all three had different base stat totals, something that was quietly corrected from Generation 2 onward, when they were equalized to a shared total of 580. But in that first generation, Moltres was technically the strongest of the three, with Zapdos second and Articuno third. The inequality was subtle but real. Players who crunched numbers back in 1996 knew this. The ones who used Articuno felt its relative fragility more acutely than they expected from something that took such effort to find. And the effort to find them was real. No map marker, no NPC giving you directions. You had to already know where they were or find out through the kind of word-of-mouth network that existed before the internet made everything immediately searchable. A kid at school? A tip in Nintendo Power? An older sibling who had already been there? The three birds were hidden in the way that felt intentional, like the game itself was testing whether you cared enough to seek them out. Which, in a way, reflects their mythological nature perfectly. The rarest and most powerful things have always required a journey to find. Section 4. The Experiment in the Mansion and the Pokémon that hated the world. On an island south of Kanto, there is a mansion. Or there was one. By the time of Pokémon Gold and Silver, it's already gone, destroyed along with most of Cinnabar Island by a volcanic eruption that happened somewhere between the events of the two generations. But in Red and Blue, you can walk through it. It's enormous and ruined, floor after floor of broken furniture and shattered glass, and rooms that haven't been clean in a very long time. Burglars pick through the debris. Wild Magmar appear in the corners, and scattered through the building, on clipboards and notebooks left behind in the disaster that drove everyone out, are diary pages. Most players skimmed past them, a few stopped to read. Those who stopped found this. July 5th. A new Pokémon was discovered deep in the jungle of Guyana, South America. July 10th. We christened the newly discovered Pokémon Mew. February 6th, Mew gave birth. We named the newborn Mewtwo. September 1st. Mewtwo is far too powerful. We have failed to curb its vicious tendencies. That's all. 4 entries. The whole story of creation, escape, and ruin, compressed into 4 diary pages scattered across a wrecked building on a volcanic island. Mewtwo's Pokédex entry in red is perhaps the most unsettling sentence in the entire franchise. It was created by a scientist after years of horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments. The word horrific is doing a lot of work there. Game Freak could have said intensive. They could have said complex. They chose horrific. And they chose it in the official game text in a Pokedex entry that small children read in 1996 while trying to figure out where to find this Pokemon. The distinction between the Japanese and English versions of those diary entries is worth noting. In the original Japanese, the diary is written in first-person singular. I discovered, I named, I created. One scientist, alone. The English localization changed the pronoun to we. A team, multiple researchers. The change softens something. It spreads the responsibility. In the original, there's a single human being who made Mewtwo, who watched it grow into something beyond control, and who wrote those final words, "Mindout. We have failed to curb its vicious tendencies," before presumably running for their life. The researcher is widely believed by fans and scholars of the series to be Dr. Fuji, the same Mr. Fuji who lives quietly in Lavender Town in the games, tending to the lost and abandoned Pokemon of the Pokemon Tower. The anime origin short that accompanied the first movie introduces him as a scientist named Dr. Fuji who had previous experience with cloning. Experience gained through a deeply personal experiment to bring back his dead daughter, Gia, Amber. Team Rocket's leader Giovanni found Dr. Fuji, funded his research, and pointed him at Mew. What emerged was Mewtwo. But here's the part that changes everything about Mewtwo's characterization. In the movie's prologue, before the main story begins, you see young Mewtwo as a child, confused, afraid, aware that it exists in a tube of fluid, reaching out to the voice of a little girl named Amber, who is also a clone in another tank. They are friends, the only connection either of them has. And then the scientists can't stabilize Amber's cellular structure. The clone fails. Amber disappears. And Mewtwo, grieving a friend who existed for only a few days, starts asking questions that the scientists can't answer. Why do I exist? What is my purpose? Why did they make me? And the scientists, fearing that this line of questioning will make Mewtwo uncontrollable, decide to wipe its memory, which makes everything worse. Because the grief goes underground but doesn't disappear, the suppressed emotion becomes rage. The rage becomes the vicious tendencies that the diary records. Mewtwo is not a weapon that turned on its creators. It's a being that was created without consent, had its memory stolen, was robbed of its only friendship, and then told that its purpose is to serve the people who did all of this to it. Its anger isn't irrational. It's the entirely predictable result of being treated as a product. The design of Mewtwo carries this in every line. Ken Sugimori, who designed it, deliberately gave it an unsettling aura. The way its eyes sit, the way its posture is simultaneously powerful and wounded, the tube at the back of its neck like a scar from the laboratory equipment. It stands 6 feet 7 inches tall and weighs just over 269 pounds, which is unusually light for something that size. There's a fragility threaded through the power. Mew, the creature Mewtwo was made from, is a study in contrast. It's small, only 1 foot 4 inches, pink and almost translucent, playful in a way Mewtwo can never quite be. The Pokedex describes Mew as the ancestor of all Pokemon, a being that contains the genetic code of every other creature that has ever existed. This is why it can learn any move in the game, not because of some gameplay mechanic exactly, but because its DNA is the source code. Everything that any Pokemon can do, Mew can do, because everything that every Pokemon is was originally drawn from what Mew is. The Cinnabar Mansion Diary says Mew was found in Guyana, South America. This is widely speculated to correspond to Faraway Island, where Mew can be found in the Emerald version with the use of a specific event ticket. In the Japanese version of that game, a faded sign near the Mew encounter location contains the partial remains of a signature, a name ending in the Japanese character G, which is the same character that ends the name Fuji. The researcher left his signature at the place where he found it, or perhaps visited once, after everything, standing in the jungle where it all began, looking at a place that was once empty and thinking about what he set in motion. Mewtwo's Mega Evolutions, introduced in Generation 6, introduce a different design question. Mega Mewtwo X becomes massively physical and muscle-bound, a transformation that looks like Mewtwo choosing brutality. Mega Mewtwo Y becomes more psychic and ethereal, lighter, more cerebral, more like something that has transcended physical form. The same base being pushed in two completely opposite directions by two different types of focused power. The duality in those two forms feels like a representation of the choice Mewtwo itself makes, between becoming what it was made to be, a weapon, or becoming something else entirely. In the first movie's resolution, Mewtwo watches the humans and their Pokémon crying over the aftermath of a battle it forced. It sees that grief is the same whether it comes from a human or a clone. That emotion is not a human invention. That the things it was told made it lesser, its artificial origin, its lack of a natural history, are irrelevant to whether it can feel, whether it can care, whether it deserves to exist on its own terms. It erases everyone's memory of what happened and disappears. Not destroyed, not defeated, gone. Choosing to vanish rather than stay in a world it hasn't yet decided what to do with. Somewhere in the mountains north of Cerulean City, in a cave that requires you to have already conquered the entire Pokémon League before you can enter, something massive and powerful and deeply, privately wounded is sitting in the dark, waiting for someone who comes not to capture it as a trophy, but who might actually understand it. That's Mewtwo. That's the experiment in the mansion. Section 5. Lugia, the diving Pokémon, and the creature born from a writer's grief. Lugia is one of those Pokémon whose origin story, when you find out the truth of it, becomes inseparable from the creature itself. Most people assume Lugia was created by Game Freak, by Ken Sugimori and the design team in the usual way. The reality is stranger. Lugia was created by Takeshi Shudo, the head writer for the early Pokémon anime. He was the same writer responsible for the original anime series, for the first 3 Pokémon movies, and for much of the moral and emotional architecture that gave the early anime its particular feeling. He was also a man in deep personal difficulty when he created Lugia. His own writings, published on a personal blog and later translated for international audiences, describe his reliance on alcohol and over-the-counter tranquilizers during the creative process. A period of his life when his health was declining and his relationship with the franchise that had consumed him was becoming complicated. He created Lugia for Pokémon, the movie 2000. He wanted a central figure who embodied contradictions. A being associated with the sea who also lived in the sky. Something simultaneously enormous and hidden. A creature so powerful that its mere wing beat could trigger a 40-day storm, and yet one that chose to live underwater in the deep silence of the Whirl Islands, specifically because it feared what it might accidentally destroy if it stayed anywhere near civilization. That detail, Lugia choosing to exile itself, withdrawing from the world not because it was cast out but because it decided to, is one of the most quietly affecting pieces of character writing in the franchise. Arceus made the universe and went to sleep. Giratina was banished and raged against the walls. Lugia looked at itself, looked at what it was capable of, and chose to be a recluse. Out of consideration for everything smaller than it, the name Lugia has no direct meaning in Japanese. Shudo wrote in his blog that he chose the name by a majority vote in a development meeting, multiple people suggesting names, the group selecting what felt right. Some researchers suggest the name may derive from lugeo, a Latin word meaning to lie dormant, which would make sense for a being that spends most of its existence at the bottom of an ocean. Others have connected it to Ryujin, the Japanese god of the sea, a dragon who lived on the ocean floor and was the Shinto deity of water. Lugia's design does support that connection. It resembles a dragon shaped by water, with fins that lie flat when moving underwater to reduce resistance, with a streamlined body built for depth. The Silver Wing is Lugia's associated artifact, and the way the game uses it is quiet and respectful. You have to earn it by talking to an old man in Pewter City, who gives it to you when the right conditions are met. And then you have to find the right cave in the right island of the Whirl Islands, navigate the underwater sections, and reach a specific spot in the basement floor before Lugia will appear. The game doesn't announce it, there's no fanfare. You've done the work, you're in the right place, and then the water shifts, and something immense comes rising toward you from the dark below. Lugia surprised even its creator when it became one of the 2 mascots for Pokémon Gold and Silver. Shudo genuinely did not expect the creature he designed for a movie to be absorbed into the main series. Earlier builds of Gold and Silver, including the Space World demo shown at Nintendo's Showcase event in 1997, didn't include Lugia at all. The game was delayed. It was supposed to release in 1997, but didn't come out until 1999 in Japan. And in that delay, Lugia was folded in. Without that delay, without those 2 extra years of development, Silver would have had a completely different mascot Pokemon, and the creature Shudo made in the most difficult period of his life might have been known only as that big bird from the second movie. Shudo died in 2010 at the age of 61. He saw Lugia become iconic. He saw it on the box art of Pokemon Soul Silver. He saw it become part of what millions of people think of when they think of Johto, when they think of ocean depth and protective instinct and power turned carefully inward. He didn't always feel positively about where the franchise went after he left. He wrote about that too, honestly, and sometimes with frustration. But whatever he felt about the rest of it, he gave the Pokemon world a being that endures. In the anime, there is a young Lugia, a child, nicknamed Silver, who lives near the Whirl Islands and who is the focus of several episodes where Team Rocket attempts to capture it in order to lure out the parent. The parent Lugia's response to its child being taken is not calm or measured. It goes into a rage. It is nearly impossible to communicate with while it's in that state. It becomes exactly what the Pokédex says it normally tries not to be, a force of destruction, indiscriminate and overwhelming because the thing it loves is in danger. When it's reunited with Silver, it calms. The water stops churning. The sky stops screaming. The most powerful bird in the world becomes simply a parent who needed its child back. It then returns to the deep. Not angry, not threatening, just gone back to the silence and the dark, choosing again the life it chose before. The voluntary exile, the deliberate withdrawal, there's something worth sitting with there in the dark and the quiet. The idea that one of the most powerful things in existence keeps itself hidden, not out of weakness or shame or punishment, but out of care. Out of the recognition that being too much can hurt the things you love. Ho-Oh Lugia's counterpart, the gold and crimson phoenix who perches atop the bell tower in Ecruteak City, is Lugia's opposite in every meaningful way. Where Lugia is below, Ho-Oh is above. Where Lugia is silver-white and water-associated, Ho-Oh blazes with the colors of fire and sky. Where Lugia withdrew, Ho-Oh remained, waiting for decades for a trainer pure of heart to encounter it. The very first episode of the Pokemon anime ends with Ash looking up into a sunset sky and seeing something enormous and golden flying overhead, something the show doesn't name or explain for years. That was Ho-Oh, the world's most patient watcher, waiting for the right person to notice it looking back. Ho-Oh's Pokédex entry in Gold version is one of those entries that reads like it was written by someone who genuinely believed in the mythology they were encoding. It says those who see Ho-Oh are promised eternal happiness, which is an extraordinary claim for a game aimed at children. Not just luck or strength or victories, happiness, the eternal kind, the kind that doesn't come from winning battles or getting rare Pokemon, the kind that comes from being witnessed by something that comprehends what a good life looks like and decides you've earned it. The gold and silver color scheme, gold for Ho-Oh, silver for Lugia, is one of those design decisions that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely novel at the time. The previous generation had used red and blue as its version colors, tied to the game mascot distinction of Charizard on red and Blastoise on blue. But Gold and Silver elevated the mascot relationship into something cosmological. 2 cosmic birds, opposites in every element, one associated with the sun and one with the water and sky. The color of the game you played determined which bird you were aligned with, which bird's world you were a guest of. There is a rainbow wing and a silver wing. Ho-Oh requires the rainbow wing to fully appear. Lugia requires the silver wing. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remakes, both artifacts are required for both encounters in specific circumstances, making the collection of both a necessary part of completing the story. You cannot understand one legend without the other. The 2 birds define each other by contrast. Ho-Oh is life and warmth and resurrection and the persistence of beauty. Lugia is depth and distance and the power contained in the choice not to use it. The Tidal Bell and the Clear Bell are additional artifacts associated with Lugia and Ho-Oh respectively in Pokemon Crystal. Bells that must ring for the legendary encounters to fully manifest. Crystal is the only mainline Pokemon game where a sound triggers a legendary encounter. The bells ring differently depending on which one you have, and the game makes a point of noting this. Ho-Oh's Clear Bell rings with a sound like a clear sky after rain. Lugia's Tidal Bell rings with a deeper, oceanic resonance. The bells, the wings, the towers. An entire architecture of legend keeping, built by the people of Ecruteak City around two beings so significant that their relationship with the region has shaped the city's culture for at least 700 years. Ecruteak is a city where the past is not forgotten and not buried under progress. The two towers are still there, one standing, one ruined. The Kimono Girls still know the old dances. The gym leader Morty still trains himself in psychic-type moves because he believes, genuinely and without embarrassment, that perception can be expanded enough to see things others can't. It is, among all the cities in all the regions, the place in Pokemon that feels most like a city that remembers what it's for. Section 6. The Beasts of Johto and the Night the Brass Tower Burned. 150 years before the events of Pokemon Gold and Silver, there were two towers in Ecruteak City. They stood across from each other like a pair of ancient pillars, holding up the mythology of the region. The Bell Tower, which the locals sometimes called the Tin Tower for the silvery glint of its uppermost tiers, was home to Ho-Oh. Its counterpart was the Brass Tower, named for the warm golden color of its panels, and Lugia is said to have made its home there before everything changed. One night, lightning struck the Brass Tower. The fire that followed was catastrophic. Driven by wind, accelerated through the building's upper floors, visible for miles against the night sky of Johto. 3 nameless Pokemon who lived within the tower were caught in the inferno. They couldn't escape. The fire and the smoke and the collapse of the ancient structure took them before anyone could reach them. The fire was eventually extinguished, not by human hands, by rain. A sudden violent downpour that arrived as if something decided the burning needed to stop. And when the sun rose over the ruins of the Brass Tower, something appeared. Ho-Oh descended from wherever it kept itself in those years after the tower fell, drawn by 3 deaths that shouldn't have happened in a place it had always considered sacred. What it did next has never been fully explained in the game lore. There's no scientific accounting for it. The ancient texts of Ecruteak simply say that a rainbow stretched down from the sky, swirling around the ruins of the tower, and when it lifted, 3 new beings stood where the ruins had been. Raikou, Entei, Suicune. Each one carries in its body the memory of the night the tower burned. Raikou embodies the lightning bolt that struck the tower and started everything. You can see it in its design, in the jagged yellow storm clouds that erupt from its back, in the saber-toothed shape of its face, in the crackling electricity that radiates from its fur. Raikou is the moment of ignition, the split second when everything changes. And Entei is the fire. Pure, enormous, overwhelming. Its mane erupts upward like smoke. Its face wears a mask that looks carved from cooling lava. Its Pokédex entries say that when it barks, enormous volcanoes erupt. It is not a Pokemon that contains fire. It is fire, given legs and fury and the will to run. Suicune is the rain that ended the chaos. Blue and graceful, with a mane like flowing water and a crystal-clear gaze. Its Pokédex entries say that it can purify filthy water with a single touch. In Pokemon Crystal, it is Suicune who becomes the central focus. Not a random roaming encounter, but a Pokemon you have to pursue across the entire Johto region, catching glimpses of it at different locations, watching it test you before it ever lets you near. The citizens of Ecruteak, when they saw these 3 appear, were afraid. The story says they attacked the newly resurrected beasts, whether out of fear of the unknown, or of what Ho-Oh's power meant, or simply because 3 enormous, supernatural creatures appearing from the ruins of a building that just burned down is understandably alarming. The beasts didn't retaliate. They fled. And they've been running ever since. This detail matters because it shapes the entire mechanic of finding them in the games. They are roaming Pokemon because they are still fleeing. Not from you specifically, from what happened that night, from the violence of their deaths and the violence of how they were greeted when they came back. Every time you startle one out of the tall grass and it runs before you can do anything, you're witnessing an echo of 150 years of instinct. Encounter equals danger, and the answer to danger is to leave. There's a fan theory that has circulated for decades, never confirmed but never disproved either, that the three nameless Pokemon who died in the Brass Tower were the original three Eevee evolutions: Jolteon, Flareon, and Vaporeon. The supporting evidence is actually quite compelling. Raikou and Jolteon share the same hidden ability, Volt Absorb. Entei and Flareon share Flash Fire. Suicune and Vaporeon share Water Absorb. All three legendary beast forms are quadrupedal and have the same general cat-dog structure as Eevee evolutions. The Kimono Girls of Ecruteak, who are closely connected to the lore of the towers, each use one of the three original Eevee evolutions in their teams. It's a lot of parallels for a coincidence. Game Freak has never confirmed it. The Generations anime special, which briefly shows the silhouettes of what the three nameless Pokemon looked like before they died, depicts them as something like generic dog shapes, not quite any recognizable Pokemon species, which could mean the theory is wrong, or could mean the show deliberately obscured their original identities to preserve the mystery. The Japanese folklore inspirations for the three beasts are rich. Raikou is based on the Raiju, a thunder demon from Japanese mythology that can take the form of a tiger or wolf wrapped in lightning. It is the beast of the Raijin, the thunder god, and its cry is the sound of thunder itself. Entei draws from the Shishi, a guardian lion dog figure found at the gates of temples and shrines, a protective spirit that wards off evil, which matches Entei's in-anime portrayal as fiercely protective and parental. Suicune is associated with the Kirin, a chimeric creature from East Asian mythology that represents purity, good omens, and the arrival of a great ruler or sage. Three creatures born from mythology, killed by fire, remade by a rainbow, and sent running across the entire breadth of Johto, each one carrying a piece of the worst night in the region's history, and somehow, despite everything, surviving it. Still running, still alive, still carrying the lightning and the flame and the rain. There's one more layer to the legendary beasts story that doesn't come up often: the relationship between the beasts and Ho-Oh itself. The lore establishes Ho-Oh as their trio master, the being that created them, and whose spiritual authority over them remains intact even as they roam. But there's a detail in the games that makes this concrete in a mechanical way. To see Ho-Oh in Gold and Silver in its full encounter form, you need the Rainbow Wing. And the Rainbow Wing was what some witnesses describe as having appeared in the sky above the Brass Tower ruins when Ho-Oh resurrected the three beasts. A rainbow descending from the sky, swirling around the burned building, the sign of Ho-Oh's presence. The Rainbow Wing is a feather, Ho-Oh's feather. The artifact of the resurrection is a part of the being that performed it. The beasts were made from Ho-Oh's direct intervention, and the key to finding Ho-Oh is carrying a fragment of the event that created them. There's also the question of why Suicune specifically became the central focus of Pokemon Crystal, the enhanced version of Gold and Silver, the one that added the feature of animated sprites for every Pokemon in the game. Suicune became the box mascot, the Pokemon you chase across the entire region before finally encountering it, the one that evaluates you. The other two just roam randomly. Suicune has a path. It goes to specific places in a specific order. It watches you before it lets you watch it. The in-world explanation is that Suicune, representing the purifying rain, is seeking something pure. It's looking for a trainer who embodies the same quality it does: clarity, patience, the willingness to persist without desperation. The fact that it runs from you dozens of times before finally allowing the encounter is not cruelty. It's the same test that the purest water applies to everything it passes through. It runs through rock and soil and root and leaf and stone before it arrives somewhere clean. The shiny variants of the legendary beasts distributed through special events during Generation 5 were significant enough to unlock an encounter with Zoroark in Black and White. This cross-generational storytelling, where a Pokemon from Generation 4, obtained in shiny form through specific events, triggers a secret event in Generation 5, was one of the more elegant pieces of franchise connective tissue. The beasts serve as keys, even in their special forms, continuing their role as beings whose significance ripples outward from their origin event in ways that never quite stop. Still running, still alive, still carrying the lightning and the flame and the rain. Section 7. The War Before Hayat, Hoenn, and the trio that fought before Mao Zedong Mountains existed. Before the Hoenn region had a name, before it had mountains or cities or the trick house or safari zones or anything a trainer would recognize, there was a conflict. The exact age of the world in Pokemon mythology is never specified in hard numbers, but the language used for Groudon and Kyogre is always the language of deep time. Super ancient. Hundreds of millions of years. The Draconid people, a tribe of dragon worshippers who lived in Hoenn and built the Sky Pillar, and inscribed its murals with detailed historical records, preserved the account as best as they could understand it. In the beginning, the area that would become Hoenn was a churning battleground between two primal forces. Kyogre came from below, deep in the oceanic trenches, under pressure so immense it defies imagination. The concentrated force of the deep ocean eventually took form. A being of water, of storm, of the relentless motion of the sea. Kyogre's design is based on an orca, sleek, massive, marked with glowing red stripes that light up like bioluminescence when it's at maximum power. The stripes on its pectoral fins form the Greek letter omega, which in mathematics represents infinity, and in religious contexts represents the end of all things. The sea that has no end. The water that covers everything. Groudon came from within the earth, from magma and heat and the slow churning of tectonic plates. A being of land, of drought, of the solid and unyielding surface of the world. Its design echoes a theropod dinosaur, an apex predator from a time before humanity, covered in plates of cooling magma, radiating heat that dries out the air around it. Its primal form carries the additional fire typing, and the ability to suppress rain and cloud cover, surrounding itself with a brutal, merciless sunlight that turns the earth to dust. These two didn't meet and come to some arrangement. They fought. For what the mythology implies was an extraordinarily long time, they fought, and the side effects of their conflict were world-shaping. When Groudon expanded landmass, the ocean receded. When Kyogre expanded the ocean, landmasses were submerged. The edges of what would become the Hoenn continent shifted constantly, shaped by a war between personifications of elements rather than by anything resembling geological stability. And into this came Rayquaza. Rayquaza didn't emerge from the earth or the sea. It came from the sky, more specifically from the upper atmosphere, the ozone layer, where it feeds on water vapor and microscopic particles carried up from the surface. It has been living up there thousands of feet above the ground since before Groudon and Kyogre began their conflict. Its design is that of a Chinese or Japanese dragon, long, serpentine, wingless but capable of flight, green against the sky like a ribbon of living jade. Rayquaza is one of the very few Pokemon that has no fixed habitat in the terrestrial sense. Its home is the atmosphere itself, the invisible layer that protects the world from cosmic radiation. When Rayquaza descended to end the ancient war, it did so not because it was asked, not because it was bound to by some covenant, but apparently because the ongoing destruction was simply unacceptable. The two primal forms of Groudon and Kyogre were the most concentrated versions of their power, raw, unrefined, operating at a level that the normal forms of those Pokemon, the ones you can actually put in a Pokeball, don't fully access. Stopping them required Rayquaza to do something unprecedented in the history of the Pokemon world. It Mega Evolved. In the lore of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Rayquaza's Mega Evolution was the first one in the history of the world. The template. The original act. Every Mega Evolution that came after, every Mega Charizard, every Mega Mewtwo, every Mega Garchomp, exists because Rayquaza, hovering above an ancient war between ocean and earth, swallowed a meteoroid and unleashed the transformation that stopped the world's oldest conflict. After the battle, Groudon retreated underground. Kyogre descended to the deepest sea trench. Rayquaza went back up, and the Draconid people, watching from below, recorded what they had witnessed on the stone walls of the Sky Pillar, a lighthouse and a monument, and a warning all at once. They created the red orb and the blue orb as tools that could, in theory, be used to control Groudon and Kyogre if they ever woke up again. They documented the meteoroids that Rayquaza depends on, understanding instinctively that the creature in the sky and the rocks that fall from space are connected. The plot of Ruby and Sapphire puts all of this into motion again. Team Magma and Team Aqua, whose names and goals directly echo the elemental conflict, succeed in waking the primal forms. And in the remakes, the Delta episode extends the story to its logical conclusion, revealing that Rayquaza's relationship with the cosmos doesn't end at the atmosphere. It extends to the space beyond, where a meteoroid carrying Deoxys is on a collision course with the planet, and where the ancient pact between humanity's wishes and Rayquaza's power must be activated once more. The connection between Groudon's design and the Leviathan and Behemoth of Judeo-Christian mythology is worth noting. In those texts, the Leviathan is a sea monster of unimaginable size, the embodiment of chaos in the waters. The Behemoth is its land-dwelling counterpart. Kyogre and Groudon fit those roles with almost architectural precision. And in the mythology, it is God who restrains these creatures, not destroys them, but contains them. In Pokémon, it is Rayquaza, the sky between the sea and the earth, the atmosphere between the planet and the void. There's a visual detail in the weather trio that only makes sense when you think about it consciously. Their colors, the blue of Kyogre, the red of Groudon, the green of Rayquaza, are the three primary colors of light. Not paint. Light. Red and blue and green combine to make white light, which is to say, if you combined the three primary colors of the weather trio, you would get pure, undifferentiated brightness. The absence of any particular color. Everything at once. Something that, if you're thinking about gods of creation and the foundational forces of a world, feels entirely intentional. Section 8. The Moon and its two faces, Darkrai and Cresselia. The moon in the Pokémon world is not neutral, it is watched over, and the watching is a complicated relationship between two beings who represent its opposite phases, who are theorized by some to be not enemies but something more tragic than that. Darkrai lives on New Moon Island, which in Diamond and Pearl is accessible only through a special event item called the Member Card. The island itself is small and shrouded in perpetual fog. The inn on the island is locked, and when you enter with the member card, you fall asleep and dream your way to the island itself, which is a perfect encapsulation of what Darkrai is. A Pokémon you can only reach by sleeping, which lives in the phase of the moon when it's invisible. The Pitch Black Pokémon. Type: Dark. Its design is a silhouette, essentially. A being that appears to be made of darkness itself, with only a few details visible. A ragged collar of white mist. One eye, a body that melts into shadow at the edges. When Darkrai is afraid, or when it's in an unfamiliar place, or when it simply doesn't know better, it traps others in nightmares. Not always on purpose. The Pokédex entry is careful about this. It can lull people to sleep and make them dream as a defense mechanism. The nightmare is not always the goal. Sometimes the nightmare is just what happens when something this deeply associated with darkness gets close to something dreaming. In Diamond and Pearl, the player's quest to find Darkrai begins not on New Moon Island, but in Canalave City, where a sailor named Eldritch has a son who cannot wake up. He is trapped in a nightmare. He murmurs the name Darkrai in his sleep. The quest requires the player to sail to Full Moon Island first, the opposite island, the lunar counterpart, to find Cresselia and collect the lunar wing she leaves behind. That wing, used on the sleeping boy, breaks the nightmare. Cresselia is the lunar Pokémon. She lives on Full Moon Island and is associated with the crescent moon, the phase where the moon is waxing and growing, accumulating light. Her design is based on a swan and potentially on Chang'e, the Chinese goddess of the moon. The rings of light that spread from her body like wings resemble planetary rings or aurora borealis. Her signature move, Lunar Dance, is one of the most self-sacrificing moves in the game. She faints from it, and in return, fully restores the next Pokémon sent in. The moon giving its light until it has no more to give. The lore around Darkrai and Cresselia is one of the most quietly romantic things in the franchise, if you read the details carefully enough. The Pokémon Wiki states it directly. It is widely believed they are enemies, but in reality, they are in love. The abilities they both possess, causing nightmares, causing sweet dreams, create disruptions wherever they go. People and Pokemon suffer simply from their presence. Because of this, they are hunted, feared, driven apart. They can only meet once a year in a rare moment when Arceus suppresses their abilities to allow them a single night together, when neither their dreams nor their darkness can reach anyone outside themselves. The mythological parallel cited for this is the Chinese legend of the cowherd and the weaver girl, a story about two lovers who are separated and can only meet once a year, when a bridge of birds forms across the Milky Way on the seventh night of the seventh month. In China, this is celebrated as Qixi, sometimes called Chinese Valentine's Day. Two stars, Altair and Vega, two of the brightest in the night sky, are identified as the two lovers. Darkrai and Cresselia, the new moon and the crescent moon, orbiting each other across the sky. Their connection too powerful for the world to allow them to be together. 1 year, 1 night, one suppression of power by the universe's original creator, and then separation again. There's a different reading of their relationship in other media. The anime portrays Darkrai as a villain in some episodes, Cresselia chasing it, driving it away from settlements, protecting people from the nightmares it spreads. Even there, though, the movie The Rise of Darkrai presents a Darkrai who is desperately trying to stop a conflict between Dialga and Palkia from destroying the city of Alamos Town. Not a monster, not an enemy, a being misunderstood by everyone around it, trying to do the right thing with tools that everyone assumes are for harm. The Sinnoh region built its entire post-game around this pair. Full Moon Island and New Moon Island exist in symmetry, each accessible only through specific items, each housing one of the two. The sailor Eldritch's son is the bridge between them, a human life caught between the forces of nightmare and dream that requires both sides of the moon to save. Darkrai in particular has a competitive history worth noting. Its signature move, Dark Void, which puts all adjacent opponents to sleep with a specific accuracy rate, made it one of the most feared Pokemon in double battles for years, until Generation 7, when the accuracy of Dark Void was significantly reduced specifically to nerf Darkrai's power in competitive play. A legendary Pokemon receiving a targeted nerf because it was too effective at one specific thing is relatively rare in the franchise's history. It speaks to how well-designed Darkrai's core concept was. A thing that makes you sleep, made into a Pokemon, should probably be frightening to fight. In the deep and quiet dark of a Sinnoh night on an island wrapped in fog that no one visits voluntarily, something sits in the shadow of the new moon. It isn't sleeping. It never needs to sleep because it lives in the place where sleep comes from. And it's looking across the water toward the light of the other island, the one with the full moon feathers and the healing wings. Waiting for the year's one night. Section 9. The Tree of Life and Death, and the Norse Gods of Kalos. The sixth generation of Pokemon, built in and around a region based on France, went deeper into mythology than any generation before it, and did so quietly. The three legendary Pokemon at its center don't announce their mythological inspirations in their Pokédex entries. They simply exist, and the connections reveal themselves to those who look. Xerneas is the life Pokemon. Fairy type. A stag with crystalline blue eyes and antlers that branch into curved formations from which 7 colored lights glow, each a different hue like a walking aurora. The antlers look almost like a tree. When Xerneas walks through a forest, the trees grow fuller. It can share its life energy freely. Its signature move, Geomancy, is an act of gathering the Earth's energy into itself to share outward. When it reaches the end of its lifespan, after 1,000 years of existence, it forms itself into a tree. Not dead exactly. Dormant. Growing. Sharing its remaining life force with everything in the soil around it, feeding the forest with what it has left. Yveltal is the destruction Pokemon. Dark and flying type. An enormous bird with crimson-black wings that spread out like a cross, with a long, sweeping tail, with eyes that glow red in the darkness. Everything about Yveltal's design is angular and predatory. The hooked beak, the sharp trailing feathers, the fact that its spread-wing silhouette when viewed from below is not a circle or a spiral, but a sharp, precise Y shape. When Yveltal's lifespan ends, it absorbs the life force of every living thing in its vicinity, draining them, and then folds itself into a cocoon to sleep for 1,000 years. Xerneas gives, Yveltal takes, and they do it on a 1,000-year cycle, one sleeping, one waking, the world rotating between eras of life and eras of loss. The Norse mythology connection is elegant in how tightly it maps. Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse cosmology, is not simply a tree. It is the central structure of the universe, connecting 9 worlds from its roots to its branches, and living in it are 3 beings. An eagle nests in the highest branches, representing the sky and seeing all. A stag grazes at the roots, representing life and renewal. A serpent gnaws at the roots from below, representing entropy and destruction. Yveltal is the eagle. Xerneas is the stag. Zygarde is the serpent. Zygarde, the order Pokémon, exists in a form most people find confusing at first because it presents itself differently depending on how much of itself is gathered together. At its most dispersed, Zygarde exists as individual cells, single organisms scattered across the ecosystem, functioning like sensors, monitoring the health of the natural world. Collect 10 cells together, and Zygarde can form its 10% form, a canine shape that moves fast and strikes hard. Collect 50%, and it becomes the iconic serpent, green-scaled, ringed with black, unmistakably based on Jormungandr, the world serpent of Norse mythology who is said to encircle the entire earth and grasp its own tail. In the mythology, if the world serpent ever let go, the world would end. Collect all 100% of Zygarde's cells, and something extraordinary happens. It transforms into its complete form, a bipedal being of enormous power, its green body studded with black hexagonal cells, its head crowned with an intricate pattern of light. In its complete form, Zygarde is more powerful than either Xerneas or Yveltal. It is designed specifically to exceed them, because if the balance between life and destruction ever breaks down irreparably, if neither Xerneas nor Yveltal can be trusted to maintain the cycle, Zygarde is the failsafe. The immune system of the world itself assembling from scattered pieces to address the threat that the natural order cannot handle alone. The Pokémon X and Y anime special episode about these 3 Pokémon, The Legend of X, Y, and Z, tells a story about a king named Jan who tries to fight Yveltal to protect the woman he loves, fails, watches as her life energy is drained, and she is turned to stone when Yveltal enters its cocoon form. Jan then finds Xerneas and begs it to restore life to the barren land. It does, but cannot directly save Isla, the woman who is turned to stone. And then Zygarde appears, bringing the ecosystem back to equilibrium as the cycle starts again. Jan stays beside the statue of Isla forever, watching the world be reborn around him, unable to change what happened but refusing to leave. The AZ story in the main games is the deeper version. AZ is a king who lost his Pokémon in a war 3,000 years before the events of X and Y. In his grief, he built a machine capable of ending wars, a weapon of mass destruction powered by life force itself. In earlier drafts of the game's story, the writers had intended AZ to have used Yveltal as the power source for this machine. The connection was softened in the final version, but the suggestion remains. The ultimate weapon, the one that ended an ancient war by destroying everything in its radius, was powered by the same force that Yveltal embodies. The force of absorption, of taking life to fuel something else. AZ has been walking the world for 3,000 years. Unable to age, unable to die, the residual power of the machine still sustaining him unnaturally long past any normal lifespan. At the end of X and Y, in one of the most quietly devastating scenes the franchise has produced, the Floette he lost in the war, the one whose life force was taken to power the weapon, finally returns to him. 3,000 years later. It couldn't come back until it was ready, until it forgave him. You don't see what happens after. The scene just holds on the two of them. The ancient king who has been alone for longer than most civilizations have existed, and the tiny flower Pokémon who finally came home. And then you're asked to continue on to the post-game content as if everything is fine. Xerneas sleeps in a tree. Yveltal folds into a cocoon. Zygarde watches from the caves and the soil and the 10,000 scattered cells that are always listening, always monitoring, always ready to assemble if the world needs saving. The cycle continues. The eagle nests above. The stag walks in light. The serpent waits below. Section 10. Strange corners, forgotten facts, and the long rest. There are things that don't fit neatly into any one section, details that deserve mention, facts that live in the margins of the larger stories. The Pokemon world has accumulated so many of them over 30 years that an honest accounting would take nights, not hours. But before we let the quiet fully settle in, here are some of the best ones. Celebi is called the time travel Pokemon and is associated with the Ilex Forest of Johto, an ancient woodland that feels older than the region itself. Its Pokédex entries say that whenever Celebi appears, a new era of peace and prosperity follows, and that forests visited by Celebi become filled with life and color. But there's a darker undercurrent in its lore. Celebi exists in multiple points of time simultaneously. The same Celebi that appears in one moment is also present 100 years earlier and 100 years later. When you catch a Celebi, you are catching something that is never fully present in your present, that exists smeared across time in ways Dialga itself might find unusual. The GS Ball of the anime, an unsolvable Pokeball that played a significant role in the Johto arc, was originally intended to contain Celebi. The writers planned an entire arc around it, with the revelation that the GS Ball held Celebi, and that solving the mystery of the ball would resolve a larger storyline. The arc was written, prepared, and then scrapped when the decision was made to use Celebi in the fourth movie instead. The GS Ball was quietly deposited with Kurt the Pokeball Maker in Azalea Town in the anime, and the arc that was supposed to explain it simply never came. It remains one of the most notable abandoned story threads in the franchise. Jirachi, the Wish Pokemon, was traditionally accessible only through a bonus disc distributed at events, or in certain regions, through the Pokemon Coliseum bonus disc at launch. Its lore says it sleeps for 1,000 years at a time and wakes for only 7 days, during which it can grant wishes. The Millennium Comet that appears in the sky during the Jirachi movie is an event that occurs once every 1,000 years. Jirachi's body is covered in ribbons with eyes on them. The third eye motif connects it to Buddhist imagery of the all-seeing being, and to Hindu representations of wisdom. The wish-granting, the 1,000-year sleep, and the 7 days of waking maps onto several different folk traditions simultaneously. Dexys deserves a moment. The DNA Pokemon, pure psychic type, the result of a virus from outer space being exposed to a laser burst and mutating into something that crosses the line between organic and cosmic. Its 4 forms Adashsa, normal, attack, defense, and speed, all reconfigure its literal body structure. In its attack form, the crystal at its center extends outward like blades. In its defense form, it wraps itself in a hardened shell. Its lore connects it explicitly to DNA. Its designs echo the double helix when you look closely. It is, in a sense, the Pokemon world's answer to what happens when the genetic machinery of life encounters the universe beyond the atmosphere. Evolution taken to its logical extreme by cosmic radiation. Rayquaza's nemesis, Deoxys, appeared first in the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, falling to Earth in a meteoroid that Rayquaza attacks because it sees the meteoroid as a territorial intrusion. Their battle is ancient. Rayquaza has always attacked things that come from space, long before humans had any context for what it was doing or why. The Draconid people documented this behavior and understood it dimly, the Sky Guardian protecting the world from outside forces, but couldn't have known that what Rayquaza was fighting were, specifically, other organisms that evolved in space. Life versus life with nothing personal about it. Just territory and ancient instinct. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, Azelf, embody the 3 things that Arceus apparently decided a universe of living beings needed most. Uxie, the being of knowledge, lives at Lake Akuti in the north. Meeting its eyes causes total memory erasure, which is simultaneously the most protective power imaginable. You can never be interrogated for what you know if a meeting with Uxie erases it. And the most disorienting possible encounter. Mesprit, the being of emotion, lives at Lake Verity near Twinleaf Town. The first time it left the lake, humans felt emotion for the first time, or so the legend says. Joy and sorrow arrived in the world when Mesprit did. Azelf, the being of willpower, lives at Lake Valor and is said to have given all living beings the will to act, to persist, to get back up. Three small, quiet beings at the bottom of three lakes, giving the universe everything a mind needs to be worth having. The Tao trio of Unova, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kurem, embody one of the franchise's most sophisticated philosophical arguments. The backstory, told in fragments across Black, White, and the sequels, involves two brothers who once shared a single dragon. They had a falling out, one pursuing truth as the ultimate ideal, one pursuing ideals as the ultimate truth. And the dragon literally split apart along their division. Reshiram is truth, white, hot, capable of reshaping the world with fire when it believes in its trainer. Zekrom is ideals, black, crackling with electricity, a being that acts based on what ought to be rather than what is. Kyurem is what remained when the dragon split, the empty shell, cold, incomplete, unable to fully embody either truth or ideals. In Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, Kyurem fuses with either Reshiram or Zekrom, filling its emptiness with the other's completeness, forming White Kyurem or Black Kyurem. The design philosophy here draws from Taoist concepts of yin and yang, the idea that opposites are not simply opposed but complementary, each containing the seed of the other, forming a whole that neither half can constitute alone. The original dragon that became these three was whole. The split created something lost, something incomplete. And the Black and White sequels are about finding a way back to wholeness, not by destroying the difference, but by understanding why the difference happened. Necrozma, introduced in Sun and Moon and developed further in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, carries a similar kind of grief. The Prism Pokemon, originally a being of pure light, was shattered in an ancient conflict. What the player finds in the games is a fragment, something hardened and darkened by years of incompleteness, driven to absorb light from any source because it is trying to remember what it felt like to be whole. Necrozma's Ultra forms, where it recombines with either Solgaleo or Lunala to access something close to its original power, are framed in the game not as conquest but as reunion. The Ultra forms are called Ultra Necrozma, a being of blinding gold, almost too bright to look at, moving with a speed and power that rewrites the battlefield. The thing that destroyed Necrozma, according to the Ultra Recon Squad from Ultra Space, was something called the Blinding One, a being of overwhelming light, which is, it turns out, another name for Necrozma itself before it was shattered. The Destroyer and the Destroyed are the same entity, separated by a wound so ancient and so total that it no longer remembers being anything else. Solgaleo and Lunala, the version mascots of Sun and Moon, are described as beings that come from another world, Ultra Space, the dimension beyond Ultra Wormholes, and take the form of a white lion and a purple bat-like creature respectively. Solgaleo is said to devour the sun. Lunala is said to reflect the light of the moon. Their connection to Cosmoem, their shared pre-evolution, and to Cosmog before that, builds a genuine astronomical story. A nebula condensing, finding gravity, forming into two different types of star depending on conditions. Solgaleo is a star. Lunala is the moon that reflects its light. One blazing with its own energy, one defined by what it receives and sends back. Their Pokédex entries describe them arriving in a world through ultra wormholes from their original dimension, and the people of Alola, encountering them and not knowing what they were, created legends around them. They were called the emissaries of the sun and moon. They became sacred, revered, incorporated into the culture and architecture of the Alola Islands. The Tapas, the guardian deities of each of the 4 islands, are a different type of sacred. Each one represents a different island's nature and history. Tapu Koko is electric and fierce and playful and wild, the protector of Melemele Island. Tapu Lele scatters glowing scales that heal wounds but can be fatal in large concentrations, the protector of Akala. Tapu Bulu is quiet and powerful, associated with agriculture and the slow strength of deep roots, the protector of Ula Ula. And Tapu Fini lives in fog, surrounded by myths and misconceptions, said to summon the spirits of the dead, the protector of Pony Island. These 4 represent a different kind of legendary Pokemon story, not cosmic creators or antimatter demons. Local guardians, regional saints in a sense. Pokemon whose significance is specific to the place they protect and the people who have lived alongside them for generations. Their shrines are tended, their rulings are respected. When humans moved into the ruins of the ancient Alolan kingdom, the Tapas moved away, not because they were defeated, but because they chose to stop protecting a people who stopped respecting them. That detail, quiet and easy to miss, says something important about how the Pokemon world imagines the relationship between mythological beings and the humans who live alongside them. These are not distant gods. They are neighbors. And like any neighbor, their goodwill can be exhausted. The Swords of Justice, Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo are the Unova legendaries modeled after the characters of Alexander Dumas' The Three Musketeers, not hiding the reference at all. Cobalion is Athos, the eldest, the most composed, the steel-willed leader. Terrakion is Porthos, enormous, powerful, blunt. Virizion is Aramis, elegant, precise, fighting with a grace that obscures genuine lethality. And Keldeo is D'Artagnan, the youngest, the student, the one who hasn't yet earned the right to stand alongside the others, and must prove it. Their backstory connects them not to ancient cosmic forces, but to a specific historical trauma. Hundreds of years before the events of Black and White, during a period of war between humans, large areas of Unova were burned to the ground. Forests and plains were destroyed. Wild Pokemon caught in the conflict were killed or displaced. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion fought back against the humans, not out of evil or aggression, but out of a specifically defensive impulse. They were protecting the wild Pokemon who had no one else to protect them. They lost. Not in battle exactly. They were powerful enough to fight and survive. But they recognized that endless conflict between human civilization and wild Pokemon would only lead to more destruction of the natural world they were trying to defend. They made the decision to stop actively fighting and start simply guarding, remaining in the wilderness, offering protection by presence rather than aggression, and waiting to see if humans and Pokemon could eventually learn to coexist without war. This backstory, when you find it in the game's lore texts, makes the Swords of Justice feel genuinely different from most legendary Pokemon. They're not gods. They're not cosmic forces. They made a choice with real stakes, and they've been living with the consequences of that choice for centuries. They are defined not by their power, but by their restraint, by the decision they made to be protectors of peace rather than warriors for justice, even though they believed in justice. That's a morally complex position for a Pokemon. Keldeo's eventual inclusion in the group, earning the right to use Sacred Sword and be recognized as a true member, involves not victory in battle, but the willingness to keep fighting even when afraid. The lesson the others teach the youngest is not about power. It's about facing what frightens you rather than running from it. Which, again, for a franchise originally aimed at children, is a quietly substantial piece of moral education. The Musketeer myth, all for one and one for all, finds its Pokemon expression in a group of beings who chose their purpose rather than being born to it. That makes them, in some ways, more admirable than the cosmic legendaries who simply embody forces that would exist regardless of whether those Pokemon willed them to. The forces of nature. Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus, along with Enamorus, who was added in Legends Arceus, represent elemental forces in a way that maps to specific Japanese agricultural mythology. Landorus is derived from the rice paddy deity worshipped in Japanese rural communities, a god of harvests and fertile soil. Tornadus and Thundurus represent the winds and storms that can either devastate or fertilize those crops. In their Therian forms, which are more animalistic and wild-looking than their human-shaped incarnate forms, they suggest a dual nature, the civilized aspect of nature that humans relate to and the raw animal force underneath. Landorus, in its Therian form, resembles a tiger, a fitting visual for the embodiment of the land's productive power. Tornadus's Therian form becomes a raptor, all speed and cutting wind. Thundurus becomes a Thundaga-like form of crackling, undirected energy. The mythology of the Unova region, loosely based on the northeastern United States, draws less from East Asian mythology and more from multiple converging traditions. The forces of nature sit at an interesting crossroads. The Therian's forms were added in Black 2 and White 2 and required the use of the reveal glass to access. The reveal glass is itself a mythological object, a mirror that shows the truth of what something is, stripping away the presented form to reveal the underlying nature. The idea that every divine being has a presentable face for humans and an authentic face for itself is ancient, found in dozens of mythological traditions. The reveal glass makes that idea tangible in gameplay. Victini, the Victory Pokémon, is a mythical Pokémon whose design philosophy is worth examining. It sits at number 0 in the Unova Pokédex, before the first Pokémon, outside the normal numbering system. This is deliberate. Victini represents luck and victory as something that precedes all else, the foundation on which everything else is built. Its Pokédex entry says that it creates an unlimited supply of energy to share with its trainer. Holding Victini, you never run out of power, which as a design choice is either incredibly optimistic or mildly terrifying, depending on how you feel about unlimited power being handed to a 10-year-old in a world with functional, nuclear-scale threats. The Eon duo of Hoenn, Latios and Latios Armba, are one of the few legendary pairs in the franchise distinguished by gender. Latios is female, Latios is male. They are described as siblings, though what that means for beings of their nature is left vague. Their design is based on a jet, specifically the aerodynamic curve of a stealth aircraft, which is unusual for Pokémon in a way that feels intentional. They can make themselves invisible and can communicate telepathically with humans they trust. Latios can visualize what others have seen by reading their memories. Latios can transform her appearance to look human. The Alto Mare sequence in the 5th Pokémon movie, the Italian-inspired Canal City that exists specifically as a setting for Latios and Latios, is one of the most atmospherically rich pieces of world-building in the anime. The Soul Dew, which enhances their power, is a gem said to contain the soul of a Latios who died protecting the city a long time ago. The movie's ending, in which Latios sacrifices itself to stop a tidal wave, mirrors this exactly. Another Latios dying in the same act of protection, another soul potentially condensed into another jewel. The cycle repeats. The sacrifice is not unique. It is the role passed down through generations of Latios. Giratina deserves more than it got in its own section, because the Distortion World is one of the strangest environments in the franchise. The rules that govern it are explicitly not the rules of normal reality. You walk on walls. Falling down is sometimes moving forward. Water forms in geometrically impossible configurations. The music in the Distortion World in the original Diamond and Pearl, and especially in Platinum, where you spend significantly more time there, is some of the most unsettling ambient sound in the series. Low drones, reverse tones, bell-like notes that arrive at irregular intervals. In Pokémon Platinum, you enter the Distortion World voluntarily to stop Cyrus, and Giratina becomes not the villain, but a kind of guide. You follow it through the impossible space, navigating toward the point where Cyrus has gone too far. Giratina understands its world the way a fish understands water. You, the player, are the alien here. The rules that seem broken from your perspective are simply the Distortion World's normal rules. There's an argument that can be made, and fans have been making it for years, that Giratina's exile was not simply a punishment, but a calling. Antimatter needs to exist somewhere. The Distortion World needs to be maintained. If Giratina were not there, the inverse of reality would have no guardian. Perhaps Arceus, in the act of banishing the child whose violence it could not tolerate in the physical world, was actually placing the only being capable of maintaining the anti-universe in the only place that needed maintaining. The punishment and the purpose converged. The Great Tau Dragon of Unova, which preceded and became the 3 Tau members, is described only in fragments and legend texts within Black and White 2. It was complete. Then 2 brothers with opposite visions argued about truth versus ideals, and the dragon that had been their shared partner for years simply could not sustain 2 such violently opposing human wills. It split. Not violently, not in an explosion. The text suggests something quieter. The dragon came apart along the fault line of the brothers' disagreement, each half taking the nature of the human it was closest to. And what remained? The cold, hollow Kyurem. is what you find inside the giant chasm in northeastern Unova. Kyurem's Pokedex entries call it a vessel for power that has been waiting since time immemorial for the hero who can reclaim it. For an ice dragon that lives in a frozen crater at the far end of the region, that's a remarkably patient kind of hope. Regigigas, the colossal Pokemon, is said to have towed continents into position using massive ropes. The implication is that the current arrangement of the Pokemon world's land masses, the specific shapes of the regions as they exist in their respective games, is not geological chance, but the deliberate work of a Pokemon. Regigigas pulled the land where it needed to go. The Regigolems it created, Regirock, Registeel, Registeel, and in later games, Regieleki and Regidrago, were made from different materials to embody different aspects of the natural world. Stone, ice, steel, electricity, dragon, and then, after all of this world-shaping work, Regigigas was sealed. The Snowpoint Temple in Sinnoh houses it in a sleeping state, maintained by the presence of the 3 original Regigolems in the player's party. There's a reason the game mechanics require you to have Regirock, Regis, and Registeel to wake Regigigas. You are literally showing it the things it made, the evidence of its own work, to convince it to open its eyes. The slow start ability, which halves Regigigas' attack and speed for 5 turns at the start of any battle, is either the greatest penalty ability in the franchise or a piece of lore embedded in the mechanics. A being that spent an unknowable period in a sealed, hibernating state, suddenly woken, needs a moment to remember what it is. The numbers back this up. Fully activated Regigigas, past those 5 slow turns, has base stats that should make it one of the most devastating physical attackers in the game. The ability that holds it back is not a design flaw. It's the expression of what it means to be an ancient thing returning to consciousness. Something magnificent and vast, still remembering how to move. And somewhere above all of this, above every lake guardian and every creation dragon, and every sun lion and every moon bat, and every fire god reborn from lightning, a single being exists in a meadow full of golden light, with 16 arms, or 1,000 arms, or however many it needs right now, watching everything it made be exactly as complicated and beautiful and strange as it somehow always knew it would be. The universe it built from nothing, still running, still surprising it, still dreaming, maybe, in the long grass at the center of everything. Let the stories settle now. Let the lake guardians return to their depths. Let Lugia dive back beneath the Whirl Islands. Let the beasts continue their long, anxious run across the Johto grasslands. Let the great serpent Zygarde scatter back into 1,000 cells, seeping into the soil of the Kalos Forest, listening to the roots. You know so much more now than you did when you first settled in. Not just about Pokemon, about the mythologies of our own world that found their way into these stories. The Norse world tree, the Chinese folktale of separated lovers, the Persian bird of ancient wisdom, the DNA spiral and the cosmic virus, the Shinto thunder gods, and the sea dragons of the deep. The people who made these games were scholars and storytellers as much as they were game designers, and the things they quietly embedded in lore texts and Pokedex entries and environmental details could fill volumes that most players never open. But you open them tonight. If any of these stories are still rolling around in your head as you drift off, the single researcher writing 4 diary entries in the dark of the Cinnabar Mansion, the night the brass tower burned, and 3 nameless Pokemon came back as gods, the voluntary exile of a creature powerful enough to destroy every building it passes, the ancient king still standing beside a stone statue waiting for forgiveness that took 3,000 years to arrive, let them be the soft furniture of your sleep. Good stories make good dreams. If this helped you rest, I'd love it if you left a like. And if you want more nights like this one, a subscription would mean everything. There are so many more stories where these came from. So many more rooms in this vast and strange and beautiful world. Sleep well.